In the vast, untamed heart of the American West, a promise can be the only thing shielding you from the grave. This isn't just a story of dust and danger. It's the account of Josephine Hayes, a woman of letters and faith cast adrift in a world determined to break her. And it's the story of Kaylin, a Lakota warrior, bound by ancient traditions, yet living on the edge of a new, violent frontier. When their two worlds collided in a storm of desperation and prejudice, a single impossible offer was made. Could a vow whispered in the dead of night rewrite their destinies, or would the brutal realities of the West tear them apart and bury their hopes forever? Stay with us as we unravel a tale of courage, betrayal, and a love that defied a nation. The sky over the Dakota Territory was the color of a fresh bruise, a swirling canvas of sullen purple and angry gray. Josephine Hayes clutched the rough wool of her shawl, the fabric a poor defense against a wind that carried the scent of rain and something wilder, something ancient. The back wheel of the wagon, her last link to a life of ordered certainty in Boston, was splintered beyond repair. Its jagged spokes pointed accusingly at the heavens, a monument to her folly. Her father, Reverend Michael Hayes, had succumbed to a fever 3 days prior his final sermon, a series of ragged breaths in the suffocating heat of the wagon. She had buried him herself, her soft hands raw from digging into the unyielding earth. Now she was alone. The horse, a weary gelding named Piety, stood with his head low, his tail flicking listlessly at the buzzing flies. Josephine had her father's Bible, a canteen half filled with brackish water, and a crate of books that now seemed a laughable luxury. She was a scholar, a woman raised on verse and logic, but the unforgiving landscape before her was a text she could not decipher. Every rustle in the tall grass sounded like a predator. Every shadow seemed to twist into a threat. The first drop of rain was cold and fat, striking her forehead with the force of a thrown pebble. Then another and another. Within moments, the bruised sky wept, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the dusty trail into a river of mud. The wind howled, tearing at her bonnet and whipping her auburn hair across her face. Piety whinnied a sound of pure terror that mirrored the scream trapped in Josephine's own throat. She scrambled back into the wagon, pulling a canvas tarp over herself, but it was a futile gesture. Water streamed through the gaps, soaking her to the bone, the cold seeping into her marrow. She must have drifted into a state of shivering semi-consciousness, for when she next became aware, the rain had lessened to a steady, miserable drumming. The world outside was a dim, grey twilight. And there was a figure. He stood beside the terrified horse, one hand resting gently on its neck, speaking in a low, calm tone she couldn't understand. He was tall, with the kind of lean, powerful build that spoke of a life lived in motion. His black hair was long and unbound, plastered to his face and shoulders by the rain. His skin was the color of rich copper, and his cheekbones were high and severe. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic clothes that seemed to be a part of the landscape itself. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intensely observant, and held a stillness that was both unnerving and compelling. He looked at her, not with the leering curiosity of the men in the trail towns, but with a quiet, assessing gravity. He was, she knew, with a jolt of primal fear instilled by years of her father's sermons, an Indian, a warrior. Her hand instinctively went to the small, ornate pistol her father had insisted she carry its cold weight, a useless comfort inside her saturated reticule. The man's eyes flicked to the movement, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, but he did not react. He finished calming her horse before turning his full attention to her. "Your wagon is broken," he said. His voice was a low baritone, his English surprisingly clear with only a slight musical cadence. It was a statement, not a question. Josephine could only nod her teeth, chattering too violently for speech. She pulled the sodden tarp tighter around her shoulders. The storm will worsen. The creek will rise. You cannot stay here. He looked around, his gaze sweeping the horizon, as if reading a map invisible to her. You will die. The bluntness of his words cut through her fear, replaced by a spike of indignation. I will manage. She stammered the lie, tasting like ash in her mouth. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. It was not a smile of amusement, but of weary understanding. The land does not care if you manage. It takes what it is owed. He gestured with his chin towards the east. The settlement Redemption Gulch is a day's ride. You will not make it on foot before nightfall. The wolves will be hunting. Every word he spoke hammered another nail into the coffin of her hope. She was no frontierswoman. She was a poet, a teacher, a gentle soul utterly unprepared for this savage garden. Tears of frustration and despair pricked at her eyes, mingling with the rain on her cheeks. The warrior watched her, his expression unchanging. He seemed to be weighing a decision. For a long moment, the only sounds were the dripping rain and the soft sigh of the wind. Then he spoke again. My camp is near. There is fire and shelter. You can come. The offer hung in the air, both a lifeline and a terrifying leap into the unknown. Everything she had ever been taught screamed at her to refuse. He was the savage, the heathen, the danger in the wilderness her father had warned against. But her father was dead, his warnings buried with him. And the man before her, this savage, was the only human being she had seen in days. His stillness felt more like strength than menace, his directness more like honesty than aggression. Why? She finally whispered the word, barely audible. Why would you help me? He looked from her pale, frightened face to the broken wagon, then back again. My mother taught me that a traveler in need is a test of a man's spirit, he said simply. To leave you is to fail that test. It is not our way. He untied Piety from the wagon's harness with practiced ease. I am Kalen. He offered no more explanation. He didn't plead or cajole. He stated a fact and waited for her decision. Josephine looked at the wreckage of her past and the vast, hostile wilderness that represented her future. To stay was certain death. To go with him was a chance, however slim, however terrifying. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slid out of the wagon, her boots sinking into the thick mud. Her fine Boston dress was ruined, caked in grime, and torn at the hem. She was a pathetic sight, a broken doll cast aside on the prairie. But as she met Kalen's steady gaze, a tiny, defiant ember of her spirit rekindled. She would not die here. I am Josephine Hayes, she said, her voice stronger now. Kalen gave a slight formal nod. Come, Josephine Hayes. The night is listening. He led the horse, and she followed, stumbling in his wake. They left the shattered wagon behind, a lone monument to a life that was over. He moved through the darkening woods with a grace that defied the treacherous terrain, finding a path where she saw only a tangle of wet brush and rock. He did not speak again, but his presence was a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm. After what felt like an eternity, a warm orange glow appeared through the trees. The scent of wood smoke reached her, the most welcoming smell she had ever known. They entered a small clearing sheltered by a ring of ancient pines. A small, sturdy teepee stood in the center, smoke curling from its peak. Kalen tied Piety to a low-hanging branch where he would be sheltered from the worst of the wind. He then held back the flap of the tipi for her. Hesitantly, Josephine stooped and entered. The warmth inside was immediate and enveloping. A small contained fire burned in the center, its light dancing on the hide walls. Simple furs were laid out for sleeping, and a few pouches and tools were stored neatly against the perimeter. It was sparse, but it was clean, warm, and dry. It was life. She stood dripping in the center of the small space, suddenly aware of her intrusion. This was his home. A home more foreign to her than any place she had ever imagined. She was a stranger, a trespasser from another world. Kaelin entered behind her, letting the flap fall closed, shutting out the storm. The space suddenly felt much smaller. He moved to the fire, adding a small piece of wood. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, his back to her. He gestured to a pile of soft, thick furs. "There are blankets. I will wait outside." He made to leave, but Josephine's voice stopped him. "No, please, don't." The thought of being left alone, even for a moment, was unbearable. The storm. He paused, his hand on the flap, and looked back at her. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes, the plea that went beyond mere words. He gave a slow nod of understanding. Without a word, he turned his back to her, completely facing the wall of the teepee, granting her privacy in the only way he could, within the intimate space. With trembling fingers, Josephine unbuttoned her sodden dress, her corset, her layers of petticoats, until she stood in her thin chemise. The firelight felt warm on her skin. She quickly wrapped herself in one of the heavy, surprisingly soft buffalo hides, its scent earthy and wild. She huddled near the fire, pulling the robe tight, and tucked her wet clothes as far to the side as she could. I'm decent," she murmured. Kaelin turned back around. He looked at her huddled in his blanket, her face pale, and her wide blue eyes luminous in the firelight. He took another fur for himself and sat on the opposite side of the fire. He said nothing, simply sharing the silence and the warmth. The storm raged outside, a wild beast clawing at the edges of their small sanctuary, but inside the teepee there was a profound and unexpected peace. Josephine Hayes, the Reverend's daughter from Boston, was safe in the home of a Lakota warrior, and she knew with a certainty that shook her to her very soul that nothing in her life would ever be the same. The dawn broke clear and cold, washing the world in pale shades of gold and rose. The air smelled clean, scrubbed by the storm. When Josephine emerged from the teepee, wrapped in the dry but oversized buffalo robe, she found Kaelin already tending to a small fire. Piety was calmly chewing on a patch of grass nearby. Kaelin had retrieved her reticule and her crate of books from the wagon, which he'd set under a dry ledge of rock. The gesture of saving her books, her last connection to her father and her old life, touched her more deeply than he could ever know. He handed her a piece of jerky and a tin cup of a hot, bitter tea brewed from herbs. It was a meager breakfast, but it warmed her from the inside out. "The town is a half-day's walk," Kaelin said, his eyes on the eastern horizon. "I will take you. You don't have to." Josephine began feeling a strange reluctance to leave the quiet solitude of his camp. "You've already done so much. Thorn's men ride this land," he stated flatly. "It is not safe for you alone." The name meant nothing to her, but his tone carried a weight of warning she couldn't ignore. She simply nodded, dressing in her own clothes, which had partially dried by the fire overnight. They were still damp and smelled of smoke, but they were hers. The walk to Redemption Gulch was a lesson in itself. Kaelin moved with an economy of motion, his feet seeming to find purchase on the most treacherous ground. He pointed out plants that could be used for medicine tracks of deer and coyote, and the subtle signs that indicated the presence of water. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were dense with knowledge. Josephine, in turn, found herself talking about Boston, about the libraries and the cobbled streets, trying to paint a picture of her world for him. He listened with that same unnerving stillness, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Redemption. Gulch was less a town than a wound on the landscape. A single muddy main street was flanked by a dozen rough-hewn wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a general store, a blacksmith, and a squat building with a faded sign that read, "Sheriff." The air was thick with the smell of manure, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Men with hard faces and guns on their hips stopped and stared as they entered. Their eyes lingered on Josephine's torn dress and disheveled appearance, then shifted to Kalen with open hostility. The whispers followed them like a foul wind. "That's one of Thorne's Indians," a man muttered from the porch of the general store. "What's he doing with a white woman and a lady by the looks of her?" Josephine felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She instinctively moved closer to Kalen, and she saw his jaw tighten, his hand resting near the knife sheathed at his belt. Their first stop was the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, whose arms were roped with muscle. He listened to Josephine's story about the broken wheel with a sympathetic ear, but his eyes kept darting nervously towards Kalen, who stood silently by the door. "Fixing a wheel like that? Take a few days." "Cost you a fair bit, ma'am," Gus said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "I have some money," Josephine said, though she knew her meager savings wouldn't last long. As she was negotiating with the blacksmith, a man stepped out of the saloon. He was dressed in a fine, tailored suit of black wool that stood in stark contrast to the rough work clothes of the other townsfolk. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he had a well-trimmed mustache. He carried a silver-headed cane, though he walked without a limp. His face was handsome in a severe way, but his eyes, a pale, cold blue, seemed to miss nothing. "Well now, Gus, what seems to be the trouble here?" the man asked, his voice smooth and cultured. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze swept over Josephine, an appreciative glint in their depths that made her skin crawl. "Just a broken wagon wheel," Mr. Thorne Gus said, his tone suddenly deferential. "This here lady Miss Hayes is stranded." So this was Thorne. The name Kalen had spoken with such disdain. Bartholomew Thorne tipped his hat to Josephine. "A pleasure, Miss Hayes. It is a rare thing to see such a delicate flower in this harsh wilderness." Bartholomew Thorne at your service. He completely ignored Kalen, as if he were a piece of the landscape. "Stranded, you say, a terrible predicament for a lady. You must allow me to assist." "That's very kind, Mr. Thorne. But I can manage," Josephine said, her voice cool. "Nonsense." Thorne boomed, his manufactured charm filling the street. He turned to Gus. "Fix the lady's wagon. Put it on my account, and find her a room at Matilda's boarding house, the best one." He turned back to Josephine, his smile widening. "We must take care of our own Miss Hayes. It's the Christian thing to do. The offer was a trap, and she knew it. To accept was to place herself in his debt. But to refuse his public display of generosity would be an insult, marking her as an outcast in a town that was already deeply suspicious of her. Before she could answer, Kalen spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "The lady has made her own arrangements." Thorne finally deigned to look at him, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "And what arrangements might those be?" he sneered. "You have a name, boy. He is Kalen," Josephine cut in, stepping slightly in front of him. "And he saved my life." Thorne's gaze flickered between them, a dark understanding dawning in his eyes. "Did he now? How?" "Noble." The word was an insult. "Nevertheless, Redemption Gulch is a civilized town, Miss Hayes. We have our own way of doing things. You will be more comfortable among your own kind." He gestured to a stout man with a tin star on his vest who had just exited the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Brody, this is Miss Hayes. Her wagon is broken. She'll be staying at Matilda's for a few days. See that she's looked after." Sheriff Brody was a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weariness. He nodded at Thorne, then at Josephine. "Ma'am." His eyes slid to Kaelin, and the weariness was replaced by a hard edge. "You know you ain't welcome in town after sundown." "I know your laws," Kaelin replied, his voice a low rumble. Thorne clapped his hands together. "Excellent, it's all settled. Allow me to escort you to the boarding house, Miss Hayes. You must tell me all about your harrowing journey." He offered her his arm. Trapped Josephine had no choice but to take it, her skin prickling where it touched his sleeve. As Thorne led her away, she looked back over her shoulder at Kaelin. He stood perfectly still, watching her go, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But his eyes, she saw, were blazing with a cold fire. He had warned her about Thorne, and now she was walking directly into the spider's web, a debt around her neck, and the entire town as a witness. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a knowing silence that was somehow even more menacing. Matilda Perkins' boarding house was clean, a small island of order in the sea of mud and vice that was Redemption Gulch. Matilda herself was a woman, built like a freight wagon, with a stern face and arms that could wrestle a steer to the ground. She showed Josephine to a small, simple room with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window overlooking a filthy alley. "Thorne's payin'," she said, her voice gruff. "Don't mean you owe him nothing but the coin. Remember that, girl." The unsolicited advice was the kindest thing anyone in the town had said to her. The next 2 days were a form of genteel imprisonment. Bartholomew Thorne was a constant, suffocating presence. He sent her a new dress from the general store, a garish yellow calico she loathed on sight. He had meals delivered to the boarding house from the saloon's kitchen, greasy steaks and boiled potatoes she could barely stomach. He would sit with her in Matilda's small parlor, talking at length about his vast ranch, his wealth, his influence, and his plans for the territory. He spoke of the Lakota as pests, to be cleared a temporary obstacle to progress and profit. "They are savages, Josephine," he said one evening, his voice smooth and reasonable. "They don't understand the value of the land. They let it lie fallow. I intend to build an empire here, a legacy. A woman like you, a woman of refinement and purity, would be the perfect queen for such an empire." His words made her feel ill. He didn't see her. He saw a symbol, a possession to be acquired. Each polite smile she forced, each vapid pleasantry she uttered, felt like a betrayal of herself and of the man who had shown her true decency in the storm. She thought of Kaelin constantly, of his quiet strength and the surprising gentleness in his hands as he tended to her horse. She scanned the street from her window, hoping for a glimpse of him. But he was gone. On the third night, a fierce wind rattled the window pane, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness in her heart. She was sitting on her bed, her father's Bible open, but unread on her lap, when she heard a soft tapping. Not at her door, but at the window. Her heart leaped into her throat. Cautiously she pulled back the thin curtain. Kaelin was standing in the alley below, a shadow among shadows. He gestured for her to come down. Slipping on her shoes and grabbing her shawl, she crept down the back stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Matilda was snoring softly in her room off the kitchen. The back door creaked as Josephine opened it, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. Kaelin was waiting for her in the darkness. "He is poisoning you with his gifts," he said, without preamble, his voice a low murmur. "I know," she whispered, relief washing over her at the sight of him. "I don't know what to do. The whole town sees me as his charity. The town sees what Thorn wants them to see. They are his sheep. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the dim moonlight. The blacksmith says your wagon will be ready tomorrow. What will you do then? Where will you go? The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. She had no destination, no plan. The idea of setting out alone again was terrifying. I don't know. West, I suppose. California, maybe. That's where my father was headed. The words sounded hollow, a dream that had died with her father. The journey to California alone is a death sentence. Kalen stated his brutal honesty, a cold comfort. And Thorn will not simply let you leave. He believes he has bought you. A tremor of fear ran through her. He can't. I am a free woman. His laws are not my laws, but you live in his world now. He paused, and the wind seemed to die down, as if listening. There is another path, a harder one. But you would be safe. You would be free. What path? She asked, her voice barely a breath. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the scent of pine and sage and clean earth that clung to him. My path, with my people. The land provides for us. No one starves. No one is owned. The offer was staggering, unthinkable. To forsake her world, her faith, her very identity, and join a people her father had called heathens. It was madness. And yet the thought of his world, the quiet camp, the warmth of the fire, the profound peace she had felt under his protection, called to her in a way she couldn't explain. I can't, she whispered, the conflict tearing her apart. I wouldn't know how. I would be a burden. I am not like you. She looked down at her soft, pale hands. I am not strong. Strength is not in the hands, he said, his voice softer now. It is in the spirit. I have seen yours. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. Our winters are harsh. Our lives are not easy. To survive, we share everything. Warmth, food, shelter. His eyes held hers, and she felt as though he could see straight into the most secret corners of her soul. We would share a lodge, a home. The implication was clear, and it sent a shock wave through her. Her face flushed a heat that had nothing to do with the chilly night air. She thought of the intimacy of his tipi, the small space, the shared fire. She thought of the single pile of furs for sleeping. This was a proposal, a commitment far deeper than any Thorn could comprehend with his talk of empires and queens. Mr. Kalen, she stammered, falling back on a formality that sounded absurd in the darkness of the alley. You must understand, I am an unmarried woman. My father was a man of God. I have never... She trailed off, unable to voice the truth of her sheltered life. She took a breath and forced the words out in a rush of mortified honesty. I've never shared a bed. The confession hung in the air, a small, fragile testament to her innocence and her fear. She expected him to laugh, or perhaps to be angered by her naivete. Instead, Kalen's expression softened into something she had never seen before, a look of profound, aching tenderness. He reached out not to touch her, but as if to bridge the chasm between their worlds with the gesture alone. His voice, when he spoke, was a solemn vow, whispered on the night wind, a promise that settled deep in her bones. Then share mine forever. The weight of Kalen's words settled upon her not as a burden, but as an anchor. Then share mine forever. It was not a demand or a proposition, but a profound offering. A life, a future, a sanctuary. She returned to her room in the boarding house, in a daze, his promise echoing in her heart, at war with a lifetime of convention. The next morning, the fragile peace was shattered. Josephine was packing her meager belongings, her mind still reeling, when a commotion erupted in the street. From her window, she saw Sheriff Brodie and 2 grim-faced deputies marching towards the blacksmith's shop. Bartholomew Thorne was with them, his face a mask of righteous fury. She raced downstairs and out into the street, just as the men dragged a struggling Gus the blacksmith from his forge. What is the meaning of this? Josephine demanded, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. Thorne turned to her, his expression shifting to one of sorrowful concern. "My dear Josephine, a terrible crime has been committed. 10 of my prize cattle were stolen last night, their throats cut. A brutal, senseless act." "What does that have to do with Mr. Gus?" she asked, her eyes darting to the frightened blacksmith. "He had an accomplice," Thorne said, his voice dropping. He pointed a damning finger towards the edge of town, where a lone figure was being held at gunpoint by another of Thorne's ranch hands. It was Kalen. He stood tall and unbowed, his hands bound in front of him, his face impassive. "Your savage friend. We found one of my calves' hides near his camp. It seems he wasn't content with just my cattle. He was trying to sell the hide to our blacksmith here for a quick profit." "That's a lie," Gus shouted. "He came to see me this morning to ask after the lady's wagon. That's all. I ain't never bought nothing from him." "Silence," Sheriff Brodie barked, shoving the blacksmith forward. "We'll sort this out." Josephine knew with a sickening certainty that it was a lie. This was Thorne's doing. It was his answer to her unspoken rejection, his punishment for her association with Kalen. He couldn't attack her directly, so he was destroying the man who offered her an alternative. He was demonstrating his power, showing her that in redemption, Gulch, his word, was law. "Sheriff, you can't believe this," Josephine pleaded, turning to the weary lawman. "Kalen is not a thief. He's an honorable man. Brodie wouldn't meet her eyes. Evidence says otherwise, ma'am. Thorne is the most powerful man in this territory. His word carries weight. So justice is for sale to the highest bidder." She shot back, her voice dripping with contempt. Thorne stepped between them, placing a placating hand on her arm. She recoiled as if burned. "Josephine, please, do not distress yourself. This is a matter for men to handle. The law will run its course. The Indian will hang by morning. Now let's go get your wagon." Gus managed to finish it before his unfortunate arrest. The casual cruelty of his words, the finality of the death sentence he had pronounced, stole the air from her lungs. Hang. They were going to hang Kalen. They were going to kill the man who had saved her, who had offered her his entire world, based on the lie of a vindictive tyrant. In that moment, the choice became terrifyingly clear. She could stand by a ward of the man who was murdering her savior and live a life of gilded misery. Or she could fight. Her mind raced. She looked from Kalen's stoic face to Thorne's smug one, to the weak-willed sheriff and the hostile townspeople. There would be no trial, no justice. Her only weapon was the truth, and in this town the truth was worthless. An idea desperate and dangerous sparked in her mind. "You are right, Mr. Thorne," she said, forcing a calmness into her voice that she did not feel. "This is men's business. If you'll excuse me, I need to fetch my belongings from the boarding house before we collect the wagon." Thorne beamed, believing he had won. "Of course, my dear. Take your time." Josephine turned and walked back towards Matilda's. Her steps measured her back straight. She didn't run. She didn't look back. The moment she was inside, she flew into action. She ignored her own meager possessions, instead grabbing the heavy oil lamp from the hallway table. From the kitchen, she took a handful of matches from a tin box by the stove. Her hands were shaking, but her purpose was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She didn't go out the front door. She slipped out the back through the same alley where Kalen had made his promise. She crept along the backs of the buildings, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The stable where Gus kept the horses and wagons was just behind the blacksmith shop. Her repaired wagon, her supposed ticket to freedom, would be in there. The stable was dry and filled with hay. The air was thick with the scent of it. It would burn fast. It was a terrible destructive act, but it was the only diversion she could think of. With a shaking hand, she lit the lamp's wick, turned it up high, and threw it into the deepest, driest pile of hay. The whoosh of the flames was instantaneous and terrifying. A wall of fire erupted, consuming the hay with a hungry roar. Smoke thick and black billowed out into the morning sky. A horse screamed in terror. Josephine didn't wait to see more. She fled, circling back around towards the main street. Shouts were already rising. "Fire, fire at the stable!" The effect was immediate. Thorne, the sheriff, the deputies, everyone turned towards the column of smoke. The town's focus, its collective rage and attention, shifted from the prisoner to the fire. In the chaos, men ran for buckets, their manufactured outrage at the cattle theft forgotten in the face of a more immediate threat to their town. This was her chance. She sprinted towards Kalen. The ranch hand guarding him was distracted, his head turned towards the blaze. Josephine didn't hesitate. She picked up a heavy piece of discarded firewood from a stack near the sheriff's office. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she brought it down hard on the back of the guard's head. He grunted and crumpled to the ground. Kalen stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "There's a knife in my boot," he said, his voice urgent. She fumbled for it, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. She found the hilt and pulled out a sharp, well-honed blade. With a few frantic slashes, she cut through the ropes binding his hands. The moment he was free, he was in motion. He grabbed the guard's pistol from its holster. "My horse is tethered behind the general store," he said. "Piety is with him." They ran. They didn't look back at the fire now raging out of control. They didn't look at the chaos of the town. They plunged into the alley behind the store and found the two horses. Kalen vaulted onto his pinto in a single fluid movement. He reached down and pulled Josephine up behind him. It wasn't graceful. She scrambled and kicked, but she made it her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He nudged her horse Piety into a run, holding its lead rope. They galloped out of Redemption Gulch, leaving behind the smoke, the lies, and the entire world Josephine had once known. The wind whipped her hair and stole the breath from her lungs. She pressed her face against Kalen's strong back, the feel of his muscles tense beneath her hands. He was warm and real and alive. She had made her choice. It was not a choice of logic or reason. It was a choice forged in fire, a primal scream of defiance against a world that sought to crush her spirit. She had chosen the wilderness, the unknown, the savage. She had chosen him. And as they rode hard for the sheltering embrace of the Black Hills, she felt not fear, but a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of freedom. The flight from Redemption Gulch was a blur of thundering hooves and desperate urgency. Kalen pushed them hard, his knowledge of the terrain, their only shield. He led them through winding canyons and across shallow rivers, erasing their tracks, making them ghosts on the landscape. For 2 days, they barely stopped eating dried meat from his pouch and drinking from cold, clear streams. They spoke little, the shared danger, a conversation in itself. On the 3rd day, Kalen finally slowed their pace. They were deep in the heart of the Black Hills, a sacred ancient land of soaring pines, granite spires, and hidden valleys. The air here felt different, cleaner, older. The oppressive weight of Redemption Gulch lifted from Josephine's shoulders, replaced by the immense, humbling silence of the wilderness. This began a new chapter of her education, one far removed from the dusty books of her past. The land became her classroom, and Callan her teacher. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He taught her which berries were safe to eat and which would kill her. He showed her how to read the clouds to predict the weather and how to find north by the moss on the trees. She learned to listen, truly. Listen to the symphony of the wild, the call of a hawk, the rustle of a deer in the underbrush, the whisper of the wind through the pines. These were the words of the land, and Callan was their interpreter. Josephine, in turn, began to open up her own world to him. In the evenings, by the light of their small, smokeless fires, she would recite poetry from memory. Shakespeare, Keats, Wordsworth. She told him stories from the Bible not as sermons, but as tales of flawed, struggling people. She was surprised to find he listened with an intense, analytical curiosity. "This king you speak of," David Callan said one night after she'd told him the story of his battle with Goliath. He was small, but he saw the giant's weakness. He did not fight him with strength, but with thought. That is a warrior's path. He saw the strategy, the spirit behind the verses she had always taken for granted. He saw her world not as a threat or a mystery, but as a different set of stories used to understand the same fundamental truths of courage, weakness, love, and loss. Their conversations became a bridge, each of them laying planks from their own side meeting in the middle. Their intimacy grew not from grand declarations, but from small essential moments of shared existence. It was in the way he would pass her the water skin first, even when his own lips were cracked from thirst. It was in the way she would mend a tear in his buckskin shirt, using the small sewing kit from her reticule, her stitches neat and precise. It was in the shared silence, as they watched a sunset paint the sky in fiery colors, a beauty so profound it needed no words. One afternoon, a sudden violent thunderstorm caught them in an open meadow. The sky opened up, and a flash flood turned a dry creek bed into a raging torrent. Piety lost his footing and was swept downstream. Without a thought for his own safety, Callan dove into the churning, icy water after him. Josephine watched from the bank, her heart lodged in her throat, screaming his name over the roar of the water. He fought the current, his powerful strokes, barely a match for its fury, finally managing to grab Piety's reins and guide the terrified animal to the opposite bank. He emerged soaked and shivering, but triumphant. Josephine forded the now receding waters and ran to him. She didn't think. She only felt. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his wet shoulder, her body trembling with the terror of nearly losing him. He held her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "I am here, Josephine," he murmured into her hair. "I am here." That night, huddled together for warmth under a rocky overhang, the physical barrier between them finally dissolved. They lay side by side under a shared blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. The promise he had made in the alley share mine forever had been about more than just a bed or a lodge. It had been about this complete and utter reliance on one another, sharing warmth against the cold, sharing strength against the fear, sharing a life breath by breath in the heart of a world that wanted them both dead. She felt the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, a counterpoint to the wild thrumming of her own. She was no longer just Josephine Hayes, the Reverend's daughter. And he was not just Callan, the Lakota warrior. They were two halves of a singular, desperate story of survival. He shifted slightly, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. He tilted her head up, and in the faint starlight, his eyes searched hers. There was no question in his gaze, only a deep and certain knowing that she felt mirrored in her own soul. When he lowered his head and his lips met hers, it was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of quiet, profound recognition. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke, the feel of undeniable truth. It was the sealing of a promise made not in a church before God, but in the wilderness under the watchful eyes of the stars. In that moment, sharing his blanket, his warmth, his breath, Josephine understood. She was home. They found their sanctuary in a place Caleb called the Valley of Whispering Waters. It was a place of impossible beauty, a bowl of lush green nestled between towering granite cliffs. A waterfall cascaded down one side, feeding a crystal-clear lake. The valley was accessible only by a single narrow path, easily defended. Here they were safe. For weeks they lived a life of idyllic peace. They built a small, sturdy lodge near the lake. Caleb hunted and fished. Josephine gathered herbs and berries, tended their fire, and slowly, painstakingly began to tan the hides he brought back, her soft hands growing calloused and capable. The love that had sparked in desperation and been forged in flight now blossomed in the quiet solitude. They learned each other's rhythms, the landscape of each other's souls. They learned to laugh together, their joy echoing in the pristine valley. Josephine had never known such contentment. The memory of Redemption Gulch of Bartholomew Thorne began to fade like a bad dream. But the serpent had not forgotten them. One morning, Caleb was tracking a buck along the ridge overlooking the valley when he saw it a glint of sunlight off something that did not belong. A spyglass. He froze, melting back into the shadows of the pines. He watched for an hour as two riders, Thorne's men, surveyed the valley from a distance. They did not attempt to enter. They simply watched, then turned and rode away. A cold dread settled in Caleb's stomach. Thorne was not a man to give up a prize, and he was not a man who fought fair. This was not a posse, it was a reconnaissance. Thorne was planning something. "We have to leave," Caleb said when he returned to the lodge. The grim finality in his voice shattered their peaceful world. He explained what he had seen. "But he can't reach us here." Josephine protested, her heart sinking. "You said it yourself. The path is too narrow for an assault. Thorne does not fight like a warrior with honor." Caleb said, his eyes dark with worry. "He fights like a snake with poison and traps. He will not come for us. He will make us come to him." Caleb's words proved prophetic. 2 days later, a lone rider approached the valley, waving a white cloth of truce. It was Sheriff Brody, his face etched with a deeper weariness than Josephine had ever seen. He looked like a man being eaten alive from the inside. Caleb met him on the path, his hand never far from his knife, while Josephine watched from the cover of the trees, a rifle held tight in her hands. "I'm not here for a fight," Brody said, holding up his empty hands. "I'm here as a messenger for your master." Thorne Caleb's voice was laced with contempt. Brody flinched. "He's a devil, Caleb. I see that now. But he has this whole territory in his grip." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "He's made it legal. While you two were gone, he filed a claim on the land where Miss Hayes's father died. Said it was abandoned. The judge is in his pocket, of course. It was approved. My father's claim," Josephine stepped out from the trees. "It's worthless land. Why would he want it? It ain't worthless," Brody said, his voice grim. "His surveyors found gold. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to make him a very rich man. That land is legally his now, ma'am. It was a clever, cruel move. Thorne had not only stolen her inheritance, but had used the law of her own people to do it. But the sheriff wasn't finished. The worst was yet to come." "That ain't the message," Brody said, his gaze fixed on Caleb. He knows he can't get to you here. So he found another way. Brody swallowed hard, shame and disgust warring on his face. He rode into your people's winter camp, took a hostage. Kalen went rigid, his stillness becoming that of a predator about to strike, who he breathed the word like a shard of ice. A boy. Your cousin, the one they call Little Owl Brody, said quietly. He has the boy locked up in the town jail, and he's got another man too, a warrior, Shadowhawk, Kalen's closest friend, a man who had always been suspicious of his friendship with the white woman. The betrayal must have cut him deep. Here are Thorn's terms. Brody continued, his voice flat, as if reciting a death sentence. You, Kalen, will ride into Redemption Gulch and surrender yourself for the false charge of cattle rustling. You will stand trial and hang. And you, Miss Hayes, will renounce this life you have here. You will agree to marry him. Publicly. And if we refuse, Josephine asked, her voice trembling with rage. Brody looked at the ground. He'll hang the boy and Shadowhawk in the public square, and he's deputized half the cutthroats and opportunists in the territory. He calls them volunteers. He'll lead them to your people's camp and wipe them out. He's calling it a preemptive strike against hostiles. With the gold claim securing his importance, no one will stop him. The trap was perfect. Thorn had aimed his arrows not at them, but at everything they held dear. He had taken Kalen's family, his friend, and threatened his entire people. He had taken Josephine's inheritance, and was now demanding her very soul. He had left them with an impossible choice: surrender, and die or refuse, and be responsible for the massacre of innocents. The beautiful valley, their sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The whispering waters now seemed to mock them with their serenity. Thorn had not come to them with guns and men. He had reached across the miles and wrapped his chains around their hearts, and now he was pulling, demanding their complete and utter destruction. There was no escape. There was no running. The serpent had played his gambit, and the board was set for a final bloody reckoning. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. In the oppressive silence of their lodge, Josephine's resolve hardened into steel. He wants to break you by making you choose between me and your people, she said to Kalen. We will not choose. We will fight him on our terms, not his. A daring plan was forged from their two worlds, her sharp knowledge of law and his masterful understanding of strategy. They sent Sheriff Brody back with their answer. They would accept Thorn's terms. It was the answer Thorn expected, the validation of his victory. His arrogance would be his undoing. They rode into Redemption Gulch at sunrise. Kalen was disarmed and bound a spectacle for the jeering crowd Thorn had assembled. They were marched to the town square, where a gallows stood waiting. Through the jail's barred window they could see Kalen's cousin and his friend, Shadowhawk. Thorn, preening on the saloon porch, demanded Josephine publicly accept his proposal. She stepped forward, her voice ringing with clarity. I will not marry you, Mr. Thorn. A gasp rippled through the crowd. You claim my father's land under Territorial Ordinance 74, declaring it abandoned. But the law allows an heir 60 days to make a formal declaration. She held up her father's Bible. It has been 58 days. I am Josephine Hayes, his living heir, and I claim my father's land. Your title is a fraud. Thorn's face contorted with fury. It doesn't matter. I have the guns. I have your friends. Do you? Kalen's voice cut through the tension. On his words, a haunting cry echoed from the surrounding hills. On every ridge, figures appeared, dozens of Lakota warriors, armed and silent, a formidable jury overlooking the town. Thorn's thugs froze their bravado, gone. Blinded by rage, Thorn made his final error. I'll kill you all, he screamed, drawing his pistol and aiming it at Josephine. A single shot cracked the morning air, but it wasn't from Thorne's gun. Sheriff Brody stood on his office porch, a smoking pistol in his hand. Thorne crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finished. In the stunned silence, Brody freed Kalen and the hostages. Shadowhawk clasped Kalen's arm, then looked at Josephine with newfound respect. "You have the heart of a warrior," he said. As the sun climbed higher, Josephine and Kalen stood hand in hand. They had won not with force alone, but with a union of two worlds. Turning away from the town, they looked toward the Black Hills. Their promise, tested by fire, was now sealed. Their shared life, their forever, was just beginning. And so the story of Josephine Hayes and the warrior Kalen concludes not with an ending, but with a true beginning. Theirs is a powerful testament to the fact that love isn't about two similar people meeting, but about two different worlds building a bridge of courage and respect. They proved that true strength isn't found in wealth or power, but in the unbreakable bond between two people willing to fight for one another against all odds. Their legacy is not written in history books, but it's etched into the canyons and whispered on the prairie winds, a story of how a promise made in the dark can lead to a lifetime of light. If their incredible journey of survival and devotion moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who loves epic tales of the Old West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more lost stories from the frontier to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.